Hi, everybody. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about app walkthroughs again. We talked about them a bit on the last afternoon of the course, and it didn't really work out exactly right. So I went back um, and made an example that I know works. So you'll have an example that you can follow later on. So the first thing that we need to do is use the rintrojs package in our app. Oh, just as an aside, we're using the histogram app, the final one that we had built. And if you recall, right at the end, we used this other switch input rather than the checkbox input that was originally in the app. Otherwise, everything is the same as it is in the app that you downloaded from the Canvas site. So we need somewhere in our UI file, maybe I'll put it in here. We need the intro JS UI function. So it doesn't need to take any arguments. We can just use the intro JS UI, put a comma after it. And we also need to add an action button that will allow us to trigger the walkthrough. So here I have an action button that's going to be in the input element intro, and the button is going to say app tutorial. We'll see that in action in a minute. So that's all we need to do in the UI. On the server side, we need to do a couple of things. The first is we need to build a data frame, and in this case, a reactive data frame that will tell us what steps we're going to go through as we encounter the elements that we want people to hear about. So I'm going to make a reactive called steps, and in here is going to be a data frame, and that data frame is going to have three different variables. It's going to have element, which is the ID of the thing that we're, the ID of the input that we're explaining. It's going to have intro. So we'll just put, it's going to have intro, which is the message in the tooltip. And it's going to have position, which is the position of the tooltip relative to the element. And we're also going to say strings as factors equals false. And that will close the data set. So we need to think about, close it there. We need to think about, I need to switch this. There we go. Sorry. Which things do we want to explain to people? So if we want to tell them what the number of bins input does, we look for the ID tag here, n bins. Now, the way this works is that once this app gets rendered as an HTML document, it makes an input selector, which in this case is a numeric input value that has this ID attached to it. So when we come down here and we're trying to reference that, we need to use the hashtag nbins because hashtags indicate IDs. So we have nbins. The message we could write would be we could say change the number of bins to change the resolution in the histogram. And then we want that tooltip to show up to the right of the element. If we go back up again, We want the nobs element, so we could come back down and do exactly the same. Nobs. We could write another, change the number of observations drawn from the distribution. And we'll also have that one show up to the right. We have the theoretical distribution. Oh, the one other thing that I changed so you could see how it works is I changed this to an input selector rather than the radio buttons that it was before. It has the ID dist. Oh, we need the hashtag here. Here, because it's an input, it's a select input selector, we also need to have that it is the class selectize control. So hashtags are for IDs, periods are for classes. And we can say a message for that, change the distribution from which the points are drawn. And then finally, we've got the switch input that has the ID line on. And so finally, we could put hashtag line on. Turn the theoretical and the line, giving the theoretical density on and off. Period for consistency. And then we'll have both of those, the last two, show up at the right. Now the last thing we need to do is we need to add an event observer. Right, so we've got observe event, input intro. Right, so we want it to trigger every time there's a change to intro. And we have here intro.js session options equals list, steps equals steps. Now, these aren't all going to work. In fact, the switch input selector isn't going to work, but I'm going to show you why in just a second. So if we save this, I'm going to save this as 07, full app reactive intro. And we run the app. We have the app tutorial button now, and you can see that it actually works. So this tells us to change the bins, so we can change them and see what happens. We hit the next button. That moves us down to the number of observations. Here we can change that. Hit the next button. That allows us to pick a different distribution. We do that, and we hit next, and you see it doesn't actually highlight the selection that we want. So one way that you can troubleshoot this problem is to right-click on the element and do inspect element. And this will bring up the underlying HTML code. And what you're trying to do, you can see as I move the cursor around and highlight different lines, it highlights different sections of the app. And so what we're trying to do is find the section that highlights just that button. You can see it's the line that my cursor is hovering over right now. And what we're doing is we're looking for something that will identify this particular element. And here you can see the class of this element is bootstrap switch on. It also has bootstrap switch ID line on. And so we can see that our ID is sort of baked into this class tag. And so we can use that instead to identify this element. So if we stop and go back, so instead of being an ID, it's a class, and it's bootstrap switch ID line on. And if we now go through and run the app again and use the app tutorial, we'll just sort of cycle through these. And then when we get to the next one, you'll see that it does actually highlight that particular part and allows us to change the selector inside. So that's a quick intro to using the rintrojs package to build interactive walkthroughs in your app. So I'll make sure that this new script, the full reactive app intro, is available not on the Canvas site, but on the course site as well. Thanks.